All right, so it's noon. We're going to get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Rosa Rodales. I will be moderating the session today. Uh, just a brief reminder, please remain muted throughout the presentation and save your questions until the end. You can type them throughout the event, and we're going to read them at the end of the presentation, or you can also raise your hand and we'll unmute you so you can ask when the presentation is over. The webinar today is the first of a three-part series of webinars sponsored by the Northeast Greenhouse Conference and its Growers Association. And today's speaker is Professor Brian Whipker. Dr. Whipker is a professor in horticulture at North Carolina State University in Raleigh. Dr. Whipker's research interests include the areas of plant nutrition, plant growth regulators, and diagnostics. His research is, he's a very prolific researcher. He has over 110 scientific publications, which if you're a scientist, you know that's very hard to do. So very impressive. Dr. Whipker is well known for developing problem-solving guides for growers. He has put a lot of effort in developing photographic guides and cultural manuals that are very applicable for growers. So you're going to get a little bit of that today. And for all this great work, he has been recognized with many national awards, including the Outstanding Extension Publication Award from the American Society of Horticultural Sciences, an award that he has received 3 times. He has received Outstanding Extension Specialist Award by the same association, and one of the highest awards in our field, the Alex Laurie Award from the Society of American Florists for an outstanding career in floriculture. So as you can see, we're very lucky to have him with us today here. Today's presentation is titled Plant Diagnostic Detective with a focus on abiotic disorders. Enjoy and take it over, Brian. And thanks for being here.
Thank you. So let me go into share screen and we should be set momentarily. There we go. Hopefully everyone can see that. So thank you all for having me. It's nice to talk about dead plants. So, you know, when I'm happy to see a dead or dying plant, usually a grower is not happy to see me smile. And so I've always liked diagnostic of plant disorders. It's kind of like the detective to see what's going on and try to figure things out. I think my record is 5 years of thinking about something and then finally having the answer on a poinsettia disorder. That happened a few years ago. So, you know, for my career, I was like doing some math. I'm probably about up to 35 years of doing diagnostics with, you know, summer jobs growing up on the farm and then various jobs that I had the last few years. So, you know, there's a system, you look at things, you bring in knowledge and trying to figure out what's going on. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about kind of like a method to help you. And then we're going to go over some of the common problems that we see in greenhouses. For us in North Carolina, you know, for the most part of New England, with you all being over granite limestone, we're under similar conditions, but you start getting over into New York, you have more limestone or more alkalinity and high pH issues. So I grew up in the Midwest, so I know alkalinity very well also. So with that, we're going to get started. So we're going over on today this introduction. Then we're going to go over some key questions to ask if you're trying to diagnose problems, and then we're going to go through each one of these different disorders from low pH, high pH, nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium problems, and then distorted growth, and then wrap it up at the end of the hour. So when you're looking at trying to diagnose problems, the challenge is that you know, you might be trained in one area, because I do a lot in plant nutrition and abiotic disorders, but you know, you got to look at the whole thing. Is it, you know, is it a disease issue? Is it an insect issue, or nutritional, physiological? And sometimes it can be a combination of all of those. And so if you kind of look at a systematic approach, it's going to help in the process of getting you, let's say 80% there. There's always that 20% that's hard to deal with, but we're going with the 80%, the situation that's there. So before going on with that, specifically with plant nutrition, the last few years, along with Garrett Owen, who is actually now going, starting in January, going to take over the floriculture nursery extension position at Ohio State. We have been doing some publications and guides at Vert, Dirt, and Squirt. You can see the URL right there. So it's kind of bringing together all the pour through nutritional monitoring information in one site, because it's been scattered, and we kind of took the approach that, well, if you look at the methodology and then you can adapt it to what you're doing. But we finally then put things together. So we probably have close to 40 crop fact sheets sitting there at the Vert, Dirt, and Squirt. So it's a good resource to keep in mind that was funded with a project with the American Floral Endowment. So that's a nice resource if you're needing it. It's all free and available for download at your convenience. So let's get started on the topic of trying to figure things out, the diagnostic process. So if you kind of go with these rules, it's going to kind of get you in one direction or another to see what's actually going on. So there's some key questions that you need to keep in mind when you're looking at that, and the question is, how did this happen? So you need to know what's the pattern that's going on. You need to know what's the distribution in the greenhouse, and then finally, how quickly it occurred. All those factors, when a grower contacts me with the problem, we're getting at that information through various questions, and each of those will kind of give you a direction to go with, trying to figure out what the problem is that's plaguing your plants. So let's start off first with what's the pattern that's going on. So, there's a lot of different symptomologies that are out there, either like, growth on the leaves, with the one on the left, yellowing, chlorosis, necrosis, that's the black spot, or just regular spotting. So, you need to be able to describe what's going on with the plant. But then, a very quick and dirty method of trying to decipher. Now, again, this is this 80-20 rule, that when you look at the pattern of problems on the leaves, that if you fold it in half, you folded it up, is it a mirror image on both sides of the leaves? The one on the left, you can see there's a big blotch here, and then it's scattered blotches. So it's really not quite the same. Whereas this is starting to mimic each other. Now key here is you got to look at leaves that are starting to develop the initial symptoms, because when you look at this case, this is powdery mildew. If you wait 2 more weeks, it's going to go over the whole leaf, and then of course it's going to be the same. But so you got to look at one that's at the beginning. But if it does have a similar pattern like the one on the right, that kind of points you 80% of the time it's going to be a abiotic disorder, so a non-living disorder, whereas a living disorder is more random. So that little fold test will help start you in the process of diagnosing what's going on. Specifically, when it comes to plant nutrition, location matters. That is the primary method of looking at that plant and then deciding what's going on with that plant. And so whether or not the problems, the flowers, the leaves, the stem, or the root and crown, those different aspects of where it is on the plant tells you a lot about what's going on with it. And so specifically, when you look at plant nutrition, where those symptoms develop, if it's at the younger plant material, that's an immobile element because it develops at that point. Whereas if it's a mobile element that moves, then the symptomology begins down at the lower leaves. And then you have a few elements that will come in both zones. And so what are those problems? So again, when you divide the plant into young leaves, old leaves, the symptomology we primarily see on the older leaves are a nitrogen deficiency, a phosphorus deficiency, magnesium, potassium. This is iron manganese toxicity, so that's a low pH problem. high fertility, high EC, and toxicities, especially like with boron. They'll all happen at the lower foliage. On the upper foliage, calcium, boron deficiency can happen. Iron is definitely the biggest one that occurs. Water stress and zinc are all problems. I got to move over people's photos because I can't see the whole slide. And then in the middle is sulfur and molybdenum, but only on a few particular peculiar plants you get molybdenum problems. Sulfur will happen rarely. You just got to watch out, especially if you're using like a CalMag formula, because you can't put sulfur in it because it doesn't play well with calcium. So they use magnesium nitrate in a CalMag formula. So we have seen sulfur deficiencies occur with like poinsettias. So because people didn't do a monthly or periodic Epsom salt application, but it doesn't usually happen. So that the biggest problems we see are the ones that I'm going to talk about in the second half of the presentation. But right from the get-go, where on the plant that you see the symptoms already is dividing us of what the possibilities are going to be. If it's intraveinal chlorosis, like you see with iron, if it's on the top, you think iron, but it's at the bottom, you're looking at magnesium. So, the same symptomology where it happens matters of trying to diagnose it. So it helps you figure out what's going on. So then the next step is the distribution of that problem in the plant. Where the symptoms in the greenhouse or on benches matter. And so if this is a bench of plants that you see growing here, if it's scattered plants, one plant or then scattered ones at the beginning of a problem, and it's non-uniform, that 80% of the time puts you into living factors like a pathogen, a disease, or an insect. So it's a biotic problem. And you can see that here on this Gerbera crop that right now, right there in the middle, one plant's going down. When it's one plant, you're going to start thinking, well, in the case here, a disease issue, but it's a living problem that's going on with that plant. Or you see here with the petunias, you see that it's a number of them in that cycle, which probably goes back that there was a problem in the plug flat when it was coming in there, but it's more scattered. Now, on the same bench, if it's all at one end of the bench or it's the entire house and it's uniformly distributed, then you're going to look at non-living factors, a mechanical problem, a physical problem, a chemical problem. So abiotic factors that are going on. So you can see here that on these calabacoas, basically they were held too long under mist with excess water. And so you see almost everything in that tray with iron chlorosis. And so that, it's complete. Plant nutrition problems typically for the major ones go across a number of different plants in the greenhouse. And you can see here with the streptocarpus, the same thing. They're being grown pretty hungry and their lack of growth, but it's universal across the whole bench where you're seeing the problems occurring with those plants. And then finally, and this one, when people send in samples, especially when it's oddball, timing matters. Actually, it's a huge factor. And I guess back at distribution on the submission form for our plant disease clinic, there's a question of percent affected. That's an important answer that I need. And a lot of people don't fill that in, but that gives you a better idea. I mean, it makes my reply better because that piece of information is very important to diagnose the problem for those clinic samples. But timing wise, it really gets down to, did it come quick or did it come gradually? I mean, gradually you're kind of looking at it and you're seeing what's going on. And usually, nutritionally, you kind of have an idea what's happening. The problematic ones, because with the clinic down here, I'm the abiotic guide. And so if it's not insect and disease, it comes to me. And so nutrition is fairly easy. It's the physiological disorders that are take more investigation to try to figure them out because they're tougher to figure out. And oftentimes it just might be the best I can do is give give questions to ask going back, because you don't have all pieces of the information, and there might be feedback. You know, I just, there was a problem 2 weeks ago when I grower visit, and we kept the plants and grew them out. And with doing that, it's changing around where I think the probabilities are of the problem, because you could see where things are going and it's growing out of, and it gives a different answer than of the two that I thought it was going to be. So back on timing, if it's quick or if it's gradual. So if it's a quick one, you're going to see like spray burn. It's going to happen within a day or two. Now, there's some insect growth regulators that can take a few weeks to appear. Adept, for instance, on poinsettias, when it was still registered for that case, you would not see symptomology for about 4 weeks. And that one was a real tough one to figure out by the industry. And then water stress will happen pretty quickly, but you're also going to know on both these cases, oh, I sprayed 2 days ago, look, there's burn. Or, you know, I got held up and I didn't get the plants watered, or they're just newly transplanted, or it didn't have good root system. You kind of know what's happening with that plant. And then gradually, you know, even with something like iron deficiency, you'll see the initial symptomology appear, then it will gradually get more pronounced, and then you can get to the bleaching aspect that's going on. But that process is going to take you about 2 weeks to get through that. It's not going to happen overnight for the problem. If it happened overnight, there's a different set of conditions that you're going to look at for that. And so here's kind of the list of looking at, you know, what's the possibility. You know, the gradual diseases, insects building, nutritional disorders. Now, some of the moderate ones, you know, environmental calcium can come quick. Botrytis comes over a matter of days. But the fast ones, I mean, really, this little illustration is meant to look at these items. So if you have a good plant today and a bad plant tomorrow, that's what you're going to be looking at. So I applied a chemical and it had phytotoxicity. There was herbicide drift. Depending on the herbicide, how quickly it's going to happen. Air pollution, you know, that's the big one. Like I said, if yellowing happens today and it wasn't there yesterday, you know, you better be looking at furnaces for air pollution. Environmental stresses, a cold, hot, temperature extremes, the same thing. And then just like chemical phytotoxicities, nutritional toxicities, they're going to come very quickly to that plant. So that timing factor will help key you into what is going on with that plant. So you got to bring all these factors together of trying to figure out what's occurring with the plants to get your answer. You know, experience does help. You know, you gain experience to know what's happening, and knowing what some of the common problems look like on some of these disorders. I mean, it's unfortunate that Ball Publishing no longer has the book aspect, because that diagnostic guide that Marjorie Daltrey and Ann Chase did, the thin one that's tall, blue cover, that was the best-selling book they had at Grower Talks. It was great. Doesn't tell you everything, but you know, a picture does help direct you a little for what's going on, to give you a better idea of what's happening. And so, you know, if there's a plant diagnostic clinic person here, of course they're going to say, and it's true, you know, test to confirm if you don't know. You know, a pour through helps for nutritional monitoring of pH and EC, but do you need to send a clinic into a plant nutrition lab? Do you need to send it into a diagnostic clinic to figure out if it's an insect or it's a disease problem for what's going on? So that's, you know, depending on the size of the problem, that's how you figure out what's happening. Talking to your reps, you know, they have a pretty good idea if the people who are selling the material, what the common problems are. And if, you know, if it's a universal problem, they know what other people are seeing. And that's the case, will help you diagnose what's going on. So with that, I'm going to shift gears now into looking at some of the common problems that are out there. So this is kind of like, I'd call it a pretty picture part of the presentation, but you all might not like it that well. So here's what we've been doing some cannabis work, and so we got really good at making magnesium deficiency appear on cannabis, and that's kind of a collage of some of the symptomology. That was my COVID project, because I was the only one in the greenhouse back in April 2020, and so that's what I did. So the different aspects I want to talk about are first pH issues. Like I said, most of New England is not over limestone or over granite, so water quality matters. You have no alkalinity in the water supply. Therefore, that means you have no buffering, no resistance to change. So therefore, the type of fertilizer or the starting pH that you have is going to drive a lot of that substrate pH. And so when you look at the two evils of pH, low and high, you don't want to be on the low pH one, because it's harder to fix. And if the damage starts, it's more difficult to turn the plant around. Whereas high pH, you can green it in about a week if you haven't let it go too far. So let's start now with low pH problems. So I want to point out that there's, to me, I classify pH problems in three areas. You see the typical blackish purple spotting, and again, lower foliage. That's more of a manganese issue, the toxicity of manganese. But when you do a tissue test, values are high, and especially on the bronzing. A lot of times the iron is more of that problem. But again, both iron and manganese both get taken up. What's the chicken? What's the egg? But for the most part, blackish purple spotting is more of a manganese issue that's been well documented, like when the old days with steaming some of the greenhouse beds, they would run into that problem more often. And then finally, the plant on the left is stunting. And I throw that in there is that I think, and we've had a number of studies to confirm it. When we say a plant is pH tolerant, what we really are saying is they fail to show symptoms. And so physical symptoms on the leaves, but stunting is a case of where that can happen when the pH is too low on some of these plants, but you don't see symptomology. And I'll go over some of that a little more in a photo or two. So there's three different types that you can come up with when the pH is too low. So again, here's Gerbera, looking at the lower leaves, and that's a blackish purple discoloration on those lower leaves, and it can be very pronounced. And with even in alkaline areas, there was a large grower in Illinois that had a problem, and they're over alkaline, they're over limestone, and that they just ran the pH too low, and they were having a problem there, which was kind of amazing to think about that. Then we induce this on ageratum. It's a little more blackening purple going on. It's kind of a little in between. I think I did do an eGrow alert on that one. We have done an eGrow alert on Gerbera. Here is more blackish purpling going on with zinnia on the lower foliage. And now the bronzing, the poster child for bronzing. There's two of them. One's going to be a marigold that gets that, and you look at that, you say, my magnesium's too low. But if you do a pH test, you'll see the pH is, in almost all the cases, the pH is south of 5.0. I kind of use 4.7 as if you're in the 4.7 zone, 4.7 zone, it. But there are some cases that 5.5, you're going too low, but you'll get symptomology really kicking in below 5.0. So that's bronzing happening on a marigold. You can see the progression of symptomology going from mildly severe to very severe in necrosis. And once you get really at this stage, you can't turn that foliage around. That looks bad. You have to remove that leaf and let new growth occur. to make that plant marketable. And so that's why I say it's the worst of the two evils that's going on. Here's kind of some iron manganese on petunias on the lower foliage. Here's the classical case on geranium. This one is very severe. Just it's starting out here. We've had a Negro alert on this that's already posted, and here's some moderate symptomology. But for this plant right here on the left, it's going to take 2 to 3 weeks to turn it around, to make it look good, to make it marketable. And so that's very tough, because usually you see symptomology come in right near the time when you're needing to market that plant, and 3 weeks matters as far as being able to sell it. So I did say that, there was a pH issue. You can see that, here's kind of the line at 4.8, the plant small at 5.1. The plant is still pretty darn robust. Then you can see the stunting going on at the very low pH. The same thing that we found of running the substrate very low. That's basically peat moss. pH 3 is peat moss with no lime. Add perlite in it too. And so just the lack of growth, and the other thing is the lack of root growth occurring on that plant when the pH is too low. And then here on poinsettias, we also see the lack of growth, again, unlimed material. And then, and the thing was, people say poinsettia is pretty tolerant. You will get, for low pH, you do get high pH problems. We did tissue analysis, and we did not see any elevated levels of manganese or iron appearing in those plants. So it doesn't accumulate those two levels of elements to toxic levels, is why you're not seeing symptomology in those plants. Oh no. This slide held me up yesterday or this morning, and it looks like it's not being happy again. So I need to. Oh, this is not good. Okay, let's try this again.
It looked fine on our end.
I can't advance it. It's been an advancing question. So okay, I just went past it. So that's for the next one. So it got held up, and I had to reboot this morning, but then it worked the next time. So when the summary of looking at low pH, that, anytime you're playing with pH, you need to make sure that is the problem. Just don't assume it. So you need to do a pH test. A pour through, we talked about for dirt and squirt, all the methodology you need, no matter if it's 1 to 2, SME, pour through. We got it illustrated at that website, so you can do the test. You can then follow up with the leaf tissue test if you want to, but the pH for the most part will give you the information you want. And then the corrective procedure is kind of like a flowable lime or hydrated lime is the way to end up going with that. And so we do have corrective procedures at the Fert, Dirt, and Squirt. So for pH correction, high and low, and EC correction, high and low. It's kind of like a 8.5 by 13, a legal sized piece of paper you can print off and then have it handy if you need it, kind of like a mini poster that Garrett headed up when we did that. So then I want to switch gears now and talk about the other culprit, which is high pH problems. You're going to see more of that, like for the folks that are, especially the Western New York group that's on the call. So you see the typical interveinal chlorosis, but it's of the upper foliage that you see things are happening, and very common in areas that are over limestone, because that water has a high level of dissolved limestone in it, alkalinity, which will influence your substrate pH. Oh, that's good. Give me 1 second. Okay, we're back on track. computer problems. So, okay, the typical symptomology you're looking at is that interveinal chlorosis, yellowing between the foliage. And again, it's the upper foliage that we're looking at. Very classic case here, looking at this snapdragon, that it really shows great symptoms that's occurring on this plant over time. And that's because iron is unavailable to the plant, and you're seeing that chlorosis appear on that plant. Begonia does the same thing. Some species will not really develop an interveinal chlorosis. They'll go to a complete set of yellowing on there. You'll have to be pretty hard pressed to look at the initial symptomology that's going on, like with Bacopa. We already showed this photograph earlier that when there's over irrigation, iron uptake can be problematic. So it's not really an issue of pH. It's an issue of iron availability, that the plant can't get a hold of it. And, you know, when you look at other leaf colored plants like this red leaf begonia, you can see the interveinal effect going on, and it's a lighter bronze color, but it's not really an interveinal yellowing. It's yellowish, but it's more of an orangish going on with that coloration for other species that have red leaves. So then the other thing to keep in mind, there are a number of different factors that can play a part in tying up iron or making iron not available. And so if you remember back, we talked about the methodology that if it's the whole crop, you're going to go biotic. And if it's one plant, you're going to think, abiotic versus biotic. And so you have one plant here showing symptomology. We went and we looked at the root system, and the root system was basically, it had Pythium. And so without roots, Peter Kajoyan said, good roots make good shoots. Well, if you don't have good roots, you're going to have no iron uptake. And that's what we're seeing with this plant here. Before it actually is, it's very likely it's going to end up dying, but that's not an iron problem. An availability problem. It's a root rot problem going on with that plant. We had some jade plants we picked out at a grower. The one on the left was the initial advanced symptomology, and then we treated it, and you can see that we were able to turn it around, but because it was such severe symptomology, and at least luckily it had not gone to, the real white tissue can have bleaching and sunburn. It didn't get sunburned. It looks kind of like a nice variegated variety that should be marketable, but it did turn it around. But under severe cases, you don't always get the green color to come back with the plant, so you have to do it quicker. So again, if you think you have a high pH problem, you need to substrate test it to see whether or not the pH is too high. Those dirt and squirts have pH ranges that are recommended, and there are photos of symptomology of low pH, high pH, in most cases, then high and low EC. And so also then keep in mind, you're going to have to look at the roots. Pull the plant out and look at it. Are the roots good? Is it oversaturated? So it's a water problem. Is it cold growing conditions? So what really is hindering that uptake of that iron to the plant? Is it pH or is it something else? You need to answer that question before you start doing corrective procedures for that plant. And so that one fact sheet has the chelated iron recommendations that most people end up using to take care of a high pH situation. So I was asked to put a slide in to pause for the poll. So I think this is where Sarah's coming back in.
Actually, it's me, Leslie, but here it comes.
Okay.
So everybody who is looking for credit needs to answer this simple poll. And it's part of just confirming that you're really here and paying attention. And we'll just wait about a minute to give everyone a chance to respond. And again, if there's anyone out there who has not responded to the poll yet, please do so. This is just part of confirming that you're here and paying attention. All right, I'm going to close up the poll. Thanks, everyone. Just in case you're interested, 64% of folks drink coffee in the morning, this morning.
There you go. But not many Brit influence there. More coffee. That's I couldn't answer because I was part of the um, uh, uh, presentation mode, but I'd go in for coffee, 2 cups. Okay, so then we're going to talk about some of the different elemental problems. So when you're looking at diagnosing problems, so nitrogen deficiency, or you can look at it's low EC levels that are looking at the plant. By far, when we look at problems, nitrogen is the problem we see the most. And why? Part of the reason is that's the element we add the most to the plant, and it's utilized in so many different aspects by that plant in plant growth. So the typical, advanced symptomology is the lower leaf yellowing. It's more complete yellowing going on, with this hydrangea, with the coloration, you get a little oranging going on with that plant. Even, we saw sempervivum just being grown in a garden center without, it didn't get sold in the spring. And so it's still there in the fall, and it didn't get fertilized along the way. And you see that lower leaf yellowing going on with that plant. The same thing with petunias. Just, people hold back fertility many times to hold back growth. But if you go too far, you're going to lose some of the lower foliage of that plant. And here's Streptocarpus, the photo that I had earlier. The entire bench is showing that they're just running the nutrition too low for that plant, and boosting it is the answer to improve the overall growth. And so, when you look at management, just ensuring that you have an adequate rate of nitrogen available. If you're going low fertility, don't overly leach with clear water. And then, for most plants, you can get away with 100, 150 part per million nitrogen, but some supplemental fertility might be needed for heavy feeders. Like, for instance, if you're a smaller grower, you might want to put some like hanging baskets of petunias that need the higher fertility. Then you can run the rest of the house at the same rate to try to make things easier to make it all work out. A lot of times, if the fertility is running low, a single application of 300 part per million N will help restore the nitrogen levels just to get them bumped back up. If they're super low, like there were pansies growing outdoors and you had a few tropical storms go through, you might do it 2 applications to get that fertility back up. But that should get things restored. I mean, plant growth will, down here, if you get a tropical storm and you still have electricity, and even though the pansies got dumped on with 10 inches of rain, the answer actually is to go back and fertilize them again right then, because the soil's already saturated. You're not changing anything. It just hasn't dried out yet. But you need to replace that clear water with fertilizer water, because if you're going to wait till it dries down, you've waited 4 or 5 days, and for a short crop, that's going to slow down your production cycle. So it seems counterintuitive of what needs to happen, but that's often the case of what growers will do, especially down at the coast under those tropical storm conditions. So phosphorus, we've done a lot of work on. Josh Henry did his master's with phosphorus. We see the standard purpling going on. You also need to be on the lookout by looking at the roots for root rot, cold growing, and then overwatering. Very similar to what happens with iron problems. So the standard lower leaf purpling. Now, again, low pH, sometimes can fool you. We saw some streptocarpus once that I thought was phosphorus, and then we did the pH test and it was a pH problem instead. So, you got to do those tests to figure out what's going on. The standard petunia, especially if it's grown cool on the plug, you see that nice purpling coloration, and that's a phosphorus problem that's occurring. You'll see it like in corn in the Midwest that it gets planted, then you get cool, wet conditions, and then the whole field looks purple. So, until it warms up and the roots are active, then it can take up that phosphorus and it clears right up on that plant. The same thing with pansies. You do need to make sure that it's not a pH problem with that as things go on. And then here's a classical case of growing some petunias very cold. Now, what is not as commonly observed or talked about is that phosphorus can come in another set of symptoms. And a lot of those symptoms is species dependent, but it also is weather dependent. So the standard increase in anthocyanins that occur with phosphorus deficiency commonly occurs when it's cold. That's what we all think about, that, oh, it's purple, it's phosphorus. But what we've also found that when you start getting this olive green leaf spotting going on, and then here's a better example here on a poinsettia. I mean, I call this olive green. You might, it's not this color green, and it's on the interior, and that's a phosphorus deficiency. And so it's not categorized as being a common occurrence, but we see it. We see it on warm season growing of calabacoa, for instance. And the other thing is, it very quickly goes to necrosis, and you leave either the leaf drops or the leaf just turns totally necrotic and dries up. And so there's not a long time period here that you'll see it. We did an e-grow alert, I think it's 362, when we were running into problems down here on garden mums. So if you want to go back and look at e-grow 3.62, will give you an idea of some other symptomology. That year, I think it was about $120,000 worth of losses, because they weren't using a phosphorus containing fertilizer because they wanted to control the growth. And so what they did was induce a phosphorus deficiency. So holding back phosphorus is a method to control growth. Here's some work from Josh Henry's masters. So, you don't want to go with 0, but if basically for most species, if there's not a lot of fruit, you only need 10 to 15 part per million to maximize growth. Anything above that, you're just wasting your money. The plant doesn't need it. So then if you're going to target coming down and using it for growth control, basically 75%, which is basically 7.5, will give you a number that you can grow a smaller plant that's more compact. So you need less PGRs, for instance. But if you go too low, you get down to 2.5 or 0, you're going to get symptoms. And we saw symptoms develop severe symptoms develop as quickly as 3 weeks when you started withholding the material. Now, plants will hyperaccumulate if you apply it early. It will suck it up and store it, and then it will translocate. So you could go with uploading at the beginning and then coast out at the end is suitable. But you got about 3 weeks there, and you got to have enough extra in there that you don't induce phosphorus deficiency on that lower growth along the way. So if phosphorus is low, you can use phosphorus to control excess growth, but you need to apply it. Do look at the root systems, make sure there's no root rot, you're not overwatering, it's not being grown cold. And then, just something as simple as 20-10-20. When you apply it at 200 part per million N, you get 42 part per million phosphorus. So you're uploading ample amounts. So, 1 application, 2 applications, you should be good to go for what needs to happen for that plant. So then going over the next few items very quickly here as we get ready to finish up. Calcium deficiency is not as readily seen on a number of species. There's some out there, but for the most part, it doesn't occur that readily. So you can see the array of symptoms. We did an EGRO alert about this tip burn around the whorl of the zinnia plant. That's because it, just like the work that Bill Miller did at Cornell about like stargazer lily and the discoloration, those leaves are in a whorl and there's no airflow. And because there's not airflow, which helps increase water loss, transpiration, those leaves get bypassed because the important part's the flower. And so we see the lack of calcium going in there, and as the leaf expands out, those tips, that tissue dies basically. In the case here, you had death of those outside margins because there's a higher level of calcium near the base versus the tip. And as that leaf, because the outside is dead, expands out, you get that cupping. It can cup up, it can cup down. And so that's what's occurring there because of the lack of calcium being supplied to the plant. And so you need to determine what the cause is. In most cases, it's an environmental condition. It's not that you haven't added enough calcium to the plant. Now, 2010-20 doesn't have any calcium, so you could be guilty, but in Western New York, you should have plenty of calcium in your water supply because of the limestone, but you have to add it if you're over in the granite area. And so it's usually a suboptimal conditions that's inducing the problems. So, you can add a huge amount of calcium just by doing dark weather feed of 15015 at 200 part per million N should give you enough calcium if it's running short. But a lot of times the weather will change and it's going to correct itself. And so it's hard to guess it. Foliar sprays of calcium chloride is what we use for brack edge burn on poinsettias, but make sure you get good quality calcium chloride. It's not the stuff you put on the road that will burn the plants. So that is always the option there. Quickly, magnesium deficiency, usually down here in the Southeast when we don't have magnesium in the water supply, we run into more problems on bedding plants like in May. And that's the end of our cycle, so that any magnesium that was in the limestone charge basically is used up or flushed out, and we start seeing problems more readily occurring. And it's interveinal chlorosis, but it's the lower foliage. Again, iron at the top, magnesium for the most part is only at the bottom. We see it commonly in gerbera. We see it on pepper. We see it on, this is heuchera. Tomatoes are notorious for the problem too. So again, yellowing interveinal chlorosis of the lower foliage is a magnesium problem. The good news is it's easy to fix. First, determine whether or not you get any magnesium from your water supply. After that, keep in mind, like I said, you're not getting any magnesium from a 2010-20. So down here in the South, 1 pound per 100 gallons of Epsom salts is a great application method to green things up. Even if it's, just the sulfur greens things up, if they look a little peaked. And so the corrective, if you do have a problem, is just going to 2 pounds of Epsom salts. Now, Epsom salts doesn't play well with calcium, so you don't mix those two together because calcium sulfate is wallboard. And so you got to do it separately in the application. And then finally, I threw in distorted growth. And so this one's like a bugaboo of a lot of different things going on, just to throw it out so you kind of at least to familiarize yourself with that. And so here's the classical case when you're looking at distorted upper growth, and this is a broad mite problem. And so you need a 100x microscope to look under there, and you can see the eggs in the mites but a 10x, you're going to have a really hard time seeing it. And so you think that is a boron problem, you think it's a herbicide problem, but it's pretty notorious of seeing broad mite issues on Gerber, and we see it up and down, more severe some years than others occurring. Broad mites also did the distortion here. Thrips will do some similar damage to the plant to boot. We've done an egro alert on crown gall. Just the, it's notorious on scented geranium. So if you go out there and look, I think you're probably going to have it if you have some stock plants that are out there. But it's, doing the diagnostics to see what's going on with the plant. Plant growth regulators, a little works great, a little too much doesn't. So you can see the plant on the left, an overdose in the plug flat, but begonias are very sensitive. Many chemicals are not registered for begonias, whereas here's the untreated one on the side that didn't get hit. Basically, there was a spray over that occurred that gave the stunting in this case. A classical case of distortion, and this is where the rule of only maybe some scattered plants, like a disease, comes in, that boron, if there's a compromised root system, you'll see the death of the growing point and then axillary side shoots occurring of that plant. And so that's more of a boron problem. And if you also grab that plant on some of these species, it's a little harder on a Gloxinia because it's already kind of fleshy, but you'll feel the brittleness of that leaf if you kind of grab it, and it actually will crack if it's a severe case of a boron deficiency occurring with that plant. So it's hard to diagnose what's going on with distorted growth. This is where you're really going to have to send a sample in to a diagnostic clinic to see what's going on. A side story that a former grad student of mine was working for a large corn soybean breeder, and they were having a real Dickens on some soybeans, and he went through and he just, it was distorted growth, and he excluded, is it in the soil, was there herbicide, was it in the water? I mean, this place is a technology palace, and so we're going through things, and finally I looked at it again. I've been looking at it, and I said, did you look at the leaves under the microscope? Because the 80-20 rule works great until you get down to the 20, and it's like, can you look for broad mites? And sure enough, you would never think that seed-based soybeans would have broad mite issues. I mean, it probably had not been reported because out in nature, water knocks them off. But because they were moving them through a camera system, they were brushing against each other. So when broad mites got in there somehow, they just were able to spread them to the next generation, because seed-based, you don't expect broad mites to be quite as much of a problem versus a vegetatively propagated plant. So that one cost $500,000 until that one got figured out. And so, you just don't know. I mean, that's why I like diagnosing plant problems. It's always new, and you learn something new. And so I hope I'm getting smarter along the process the last 35 years. So we'll see. So with that is the last slide. I do want to again plug in that we have the Fert Dirt and Squirt online resources there that you can look at the monitoring techniques, the fact sheets, the corrective procedures if you're having nutritional disorders. So with that, I will open it up for questions. And I think either Rosa or Leslie is going to address if there's any chat questions that need to be addressed, or putting up the hand. So ask away.
Yes, thank you very much, Brian. That was great. There was a question when you were talking about calcium in zinnia, so I think it's specific to that. And they were asking if the symptoms are specific to that, to the zinnias, or if you can like generalize that that's the calcium deficiency symptom.
We commonly see that problem with zinnias, but the last few years, with summer color coming in, zinnias are a really low cost item to put in the system. I'd say 90% of the problems happen in that summer crop. Now, if there's cloudy conditions, spring crop, it will also happen. But again, think about it. It's already, the leaves are in the whirl. And then down here, we got 98% humidity. So it also doesn't have transpiration going on. So that symptomology for the most part is a zinnia problem. There are, I'm trying to think back, there's been some other species. If something really holds that bud in a whirl, and the leaves being in that whirl before it comes out, those are the ones that are going to be more susceptible. Something that's more open, like a marigold, you rarely see it. And while we always see calcium problems on the new growth, if it's just an initial one that's coming, especially if it's a environmental condition, what I've noticed, because we've run like 50 species through a nutrient disorder system, what we see is that the symptoms typically develop on the new leaves that are finishing their last 50% of expansion. Think about it. It's the teenagers. They're very actively growing, and if calcium isn't there to build those cells, then it dies, and then it expands out. Now, if calcium is then continues to be limited, it will go down to the really small growing tip, but it's going to be on those leaves doing that last 50% of the expansion. So that hopefully that will help you kind of translate the knowledge or the photo of the zinnia to other species.
Yeah. And related to that one, there was another one asking about how do you differentiate between boron and calcium deficiencies?
Between boron and calcium, to me, that is, it's actually, to me, it's easy. And that is, if the tips are necrotic, like we had on that zinnia, that's going to put that, the necrosis is the key to put you in the calcium arena. They're both at the growing tips. They're both induced by lack of transpiration. The water, it comes up with the water stream. So they'll happen at under the same conditions. The difference is that boron will first go to distortion in the thickness. Like I said, you can grab it. Later, it will go necrotic. So the first little dividing line here is it necrosis or is it distortion? And calcium, boron that you'd be looking at. Pansies, and then the species. Pansies, boron. They're just some that are pansy plugs are susceptible to that. So that hopefully that will help, because literally you can grab that plant. It feels like it has herbicide problems. You can feel the thickness. In some cases, you can feel the brittleness going on with that plant.
There's another question. I think at some point you talked about using low fertilization to control growth. So the question is about whether you recommend withholding the fertilizer or using a specific fertilizer formulation to reduce that fertilizer input.
We don't have alkalinity. Okay, so my bugaboo is low pH. So luckily that enables us to use a basic fertilizer. Our preferred one that we use is a 13-2-13 cal mag. I like any of the 17-4-17. Some of those are neutral if you're playing around with things. 17-5-17, that keeps the phosphorus low because phosphorus causes the stretch, and all those are primarily calcium nitrate based. There's a little ammoniacal and urea in some of those mixes, but the leaf expansion is a function of urea and ammoniacal. So if you're trying to control growth, the first step is fertilizer selection, and the second step is just moving it back. I mean, if you look at a lot of the larger operations, they have really dialed back the fertility amounts to hold back the plants. So, as long as you're not having a lot of leaching, getting it closer to about 70 or about 100 part per million. You start going down below 100 part per million, you might start seeing some lack of growth, but that's what you were looking for. And your key is just looking at that lower foliage. And if it starts getting pale, just give it a little pop of an increased rate. I prefer going low versus coming through and leaching out, because you're wasting your fertilizer investment.
Yes. And the last question we read today is, do you have recommendations for pH meters with kids? And they talk about something with an indicator solution versus in soil pH meters.
I didn't quite catch that. You're asking pH kits.
Yeah.
I'm a meter guy. The kits are great for a pool. We've purchased a lot of Hanna. I love the Hanna instruments. I think it's a 9316, 9313. It's a combo PHEC meter. That's what we buy. That's what we use. That's what, I mean, they, prices have gone up lately, but, and I know they had a price increase back at Christmas, I believe, but you're still about $225. I don't like the direct stick meters. That's a function of moisture. We've used the dual meters for about 20 years, and that's what we use. We use it for research. We use it for diagnostics, and it's cheap and it's reliable. You just have to calibrate it with calibration solutions. So I'm hard pressed to tell you to go spend $2,000 on something that's a Porsche when all you need is a Ford Escort and it works great.
So I think with that, we're going to wrap it up. I posted a lot of the links that, as Brian was talking, but basically if you just go to the main IGRA website or to the main Further Squirt, you'll find a lot of the resources that he mentioned as well. And thank you very much, Brian. I don't know, Sarah, do you have anything else regarding pesticide credits?
Yes, we have a link.
All right.
Do you have the link? Do you have the link, Leslie? Or do you want me to?
Yes, sorry, I just didn't have it under my cursor fast enough. Sorry about that. Hold on just 1 second.
If you're here for pesticide credits, hang in there for a link. We will be emailing it out as well.
Brian is still there, so if you want to type questions, he might be willing to answer them for you.
Sorry about that delay, everyone. I just put a link in the chat.
Put you on the spot there.
So there's a link in the chat that everyone who wants continuing education credit needs to respond to by the end of the week. I will also be emailing it out. So if you can't access the chat, I will send it to the email address that you used to register.
It is a quick 10-question, not tricky, not supposed to be tricky quiz, just to assess that you've absorbed the content. And it is required for credits. Thank you.
And actually, the one other thing I wanted to mention, there was a question, there have been a few questions about recordings. We are recording this and we will be posting this, and or rather we will be sending it out to everyone who registered so that you can watch the recording later. I'm not sure if I'm going to get to that this afternoon or Friday, but you will be getting that within a few days at the most.
Brian, I have a question. When you started your talk, you said your record and diagnosis was 5 years with the Poinsettia. What's the story behind that? Oh, you're muted. I can't hear you. You are muted.
Sorry, could you repeat the question? Sorry, I didn't hear it well enough.
When you started your talk, you said your record for diagnosis was 5 years with a
Yes.
Poinsettia. So
Yes.
just if you want to share the story with us.
It was trying to figure out why things burned when they applied calcium. So it just looking at things and observing it. We kind of knew that it was the calcium nitrate fertilizer, but it took about that long to keep on looking at things to figure it out. And
Yeah,
so that was a relatively simple. There's you think about things, you observe it, and then you come back again, and and we might even go and explore it. Kind of like a boron problem that was happening on Angelonia. We did a project then for Ball Seed Company. So that's the great thing. We got so many plants that we can play with, and it's always interesting what we can end up doing.
Nice.
Any other questions?
I think you're free to go. Thank you very much, Brian.
Thank you.
Take care.
All right.
Bye.
All right. Ciao. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Brian. Thanks, Rosa. Thanks, Sarah. And thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye, Leslie. Bye, everyone. Cheers to everyone, especially to the Connecticut growers.